although she's been all over the place and flying around recently. Thanks again, Kat, for agreeing to move your session. There is a handout in the chat, a link to it. Please drop me a line if you can't get hold of it, and then I'll share my screen. But take it away, Kat.
All right, thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here. I'm very sorry that I wasn't able to be part of more of the sessions, but the 2 sessions that I was part of yesterday were awesome. So I hope that I can keep up that tradition. But yeah, so this paper that I'm presenting is part of a sort of larger project where I'm trying to get epistemologists to think more about the role of attention in our epistemic lives. I think we tended to spend a lot of time thinking about belief and evidence and very little time thinking about a lot of other mental states that are, I think, best characterized as being part of our epistemic lives. So with that in mind, this paper is trying to argue that we can much better understand the phenomenon of doxastic wronging if we extend it from just the relationship of the agent having the belief to the belief formation process, and in particular, the patterns of attention that went into that belief formation process. So let's get started. Doxastic wronging is the idea that our beliefs, outside of any actions that they inspire, can wrong others. Our beliefs, the thought goes, can be wrongful in and of themselves. Bossier and Schroeder provide the following example in their recent paper, Doxastic Wronging. This is the party example on your handout. Suppose that your partner is an alcoholic who has been sober for several years. As they arrive home from a party one evening, you realize that the smell of wine is wafting towards you from their general direction. Immediately, you come to think that they have fallen off the wagon. In fact, they did not. Someone spilled on them. In Bossier and Schroeder's analysis, this is a paradigmatic case of doxastic wronging. The belief itself, your immediate thought that your partner has fallen off the wagon, is not only harmful, but constitutes a wrong against them. In the end, I disagree. Cases like this do indeed exude an aura of wronging, but that wronging is not the result of the belief, at least not the belief alone. And there are real harms that can be rooted in the mental life of the believer, but those harms are not the result of the belief. Again, at least not the belief alone. In the case of the alcoholic partner, the occurrence of the belief, they fell off the wagon, is not the wrong. Rather, the wrong arises from the attitude the believer takes toward that belief. The wrongly not yet accused is wronged when their partner decides to carry on with this belief, to ruminate upon it, and continue to focus on the issue despite the relationship they share and the evidence that the believer has. Moreover, whether this counts as a wronging depends a lot on the details of the case, unspecified features like what happens when the partner falls off the wagon, the nature of their current relationship, and so on. It is, I argue, the devotion of particular patterns of attention engendered by the relationship that wrongs the partner. But even in the worst version of this case, say a version of the case in which the partner has been unwaveringly sober for many years and the believer knows that the partner would be wounded at their lack of faith. In this case, should the believer bat down her passing thought, telling herself to have faith in her partner, then I think it seems as though no harm has been done. But all of that is yet to come. For now, I want to begin with definitions. Epistemic morality deals with epistemic wrongs. These are wrongs carried out in the course of our epistemic practice. Here, I'm going to mean epistemic practice in a fairly broad sense. Evidence gathering, testifying, believing, and so on are all different kinds of epistemic practice. Doxastic wronging, then, is a kind of epistemic wrong. But the definition of doxastic wronging that Bossier and Schroeder give is much more specific than this. They offer the following. Doxastic wronging is a wrong committed by one person against another in virtue of what the first believes about the second. Bossier and Schroeder highlight 2 important features of this idea, the causal structure and the normative structure. Both of these are on your handout. The causal structure is that an instance of doxastic wronging is caused by the belief itself, not its predecessors or its consequences. The normative structure is that the wrongness of an instance of doxastic wronging is owing to the belief itself, again, not its predecessors or its consequences. So we have the causal structure and the normative structure. And both of these stand in stark contrast with a more straightforward way that beliefs can wrong. To see this, consider the following example, which is a modification of the famous Clifford ship owner case. We'll call this seaworthy. It's also on your handout. The SS Minnow is not seaworthy. The owner of the Minnow, however, has customers to serve and neither the time nor the money to repair the ship. So he carries out a series of dubious inspections, chats with overly supportive fellow ship owners, and so on, and soon after adopting these habits, comes to believe the ship is in fact seaworthy. He then lends the ship out to skipper Jonas Grumby, who charters it for a 3-hour tour. The boat, Skipper Grumby, the crew, and the passengers are never seen again. In this example, the harm, the loss of the Minnow, its crew, and its passengers, is caused by the consequences of the belief. Had the ship owner simply retired the ship, because the owner believed the ship to be seaworthy, he was willing to lend it out to Grumby. But had the ship owner simply retired the ship that day, no harm would have been done. The causal structure of this wronging requires action outside of the belief on the part of the believer. But this is not the case in instances of doxastic wronging. Rather, it is the belief itself, not what you do either prior to or subsequent to forming a belief, to quote Bossu and Schroeder, that brings about a doxastic wronging. It is not the process of forming the belief that harms, nor is it the actions you take, if any, as a result of having the belief. It is simply the fact that a particular agent stands in the belief relation to the proposition. Now let's take a look at the second feature of doxastic wronging, the normative structure. So we just talked about the causal structure, and now we're moving on to the normative structure. Bossu and Schroeder emphasize that a belief is a doxastic wronging. A belief that is a doxastic wronging does not wrong merely in virtue of its consequences. The wronging, the actual normative fault, lies in the belief rather than in, or at least over and above, its effects. So it is neither the fact that the subject of your belief would feel wounded if they knew about your belief, nor your reaction of, say, disgust or pleasure at that belief. It's not the role that it plays in your broader mental life or the consequences of that belief. So if we go back to the party case, for example, the thought that is that the belief, my partner fell off the wagon, is itself causing harm, or is itself an instance of wronging, rather than the partner's feeling of being wounded if they were to find out. Bossu and Schroeder are clear that the feeling, they take the feeling of being wounded as to be a sign of a directed wrong, and often use this like counterfactual sense of woundedness as evidence that a wronging has occurred. But this negative consequence is nevertheless unnecessary, according to the definition of doxastic wronging. And this is markedly distinct from a case like Seaworthy, in which there's no real contention that the ship owner's belief, the SS Minnow is seaworthy, is itself harmful. That belief in and of itself is benign. An interesting consequence of this normative structure is that a belief may wrong even in situations in which the subject would not feel wounded. So were the partner in party to learn of the belief and agree with their spouse that it was reasonable for them to worry, the spouse would nevertheless, it seems, have wronged the partner in holding the belief. Well, the fact that someone would feel wounded is evidence that there may be a doxastic wronging in the offing, then it is an unreliable test because it may produce both false positives and false negatives. This illustrates a principle that's implied by Bossu and Schroeder's conception of doxastic wronging, which I'm calling evaluative isolation. It's on your handout as well. With respect to doxastic wronging, this principle goes, the epistemic morality of a particular belief may be evaluated independently of the rest of the believer's epistemic practice and the normative consequences, epistemic and moral, of the belief. As we've seen, evaluative isolation is a consequence of the causal and normative features of doxastic wronging. The wrong in a doxastic wronging does not lie in what you do either prior to or subsequent to forming a belief, but rather in the belief itself. So there are several standard objections to this idea of doxastic wronging, but I want to focus in on the problem of control. In the sort of longer version of this paper, I have a sort of I go through Bossu and Schroeder's response to this problem and offer a dilemma that I think shows that their response doesn't quite work. But for our purposes here, I actually just want to highlight what the structure of this problem is and talk about how I think it pushes us, just the shape of the problem pushes us toward attention as a really useful thing to think about in understanding what's going wrong in cases of doxastic wronging. So here's the structure of this problem. The core of the objection is that there's no real bridge between the doxastic and the normative because an essential component of that bridge, control over one's beliefs, is missing. As a result, doxastic wronging must be impossible. So let's begin with the normative side of this objection. The thought is that in order for moral notions like wronging, blameworthiness, and responsibility to apply to an agent's actions, that agent must be able to exercise meaningful control over the action. For example, when the doctor taps your patellar tendon with a reflex hammer, you don't have control over your body's response. Your leg kicks briefly and then goes back to rest. So if the doctor stands directly in front of you while administering this test, you are not morally responsible for the resulting kick. This is the control condition on moral responsibility. On the epistemic side, the objection grants that doxastic harm may be possible when believing something about you can, in fact, harm you. The trouble arises with epistemic agency. It is a commonplace in epistemology to argue that we are at the mercy of our evidence to some extent. When we encounter new evidence, we simply involuntarily update on it. The evidence ripples through our priors, and we find ourselves with new posteriors. Bonjour puts the point this way. Consider then the following example of putative observational knowledge. I sit at my desk, or so I believe. I come to have the belief, among very others, that there is a red book on the desk. In fact, of course, the content of that belief is a good deal more precise and specific than the formulation just given would suggest. I do not simply believe that there is a red book on the table, but rather that there is a book of a certain approximate size, of an approximately rectangular shape, which is of a certain fairly specific shade of red, and so on. What matters for the moment is that I do not infer that there is a red book on the desk, nor does the belief result from any sort of deliberative or rationative process, whether explicit or implicit. Rather, it simply occurs to me, strikes me in a manner which is both involuntary and quite coercive. Such a belief is, I will say, cognitively spontaneous. These cognitively spontaneous beliefs leave little room for control or agency. Putting these epistemic and moral observations together, the argument is that because we cannot be morally responsible for any harm caused by our beliefs because we lack control over our beliefs. As Bossier and Schroeder put it, it is just as odd to say that an agent ought to believe P as it is to say that a tornado ought to take the southeasterly path. Thus, cases in which one feels as though they have been wronged by a belief are all instances of false positives. The partner in party, then, is simply mistaken about having been wronged if she finds out about the belief. In finer course, the objection goes like this. In order for an agent's action to wrong, that action must be under the agent's control, and this argument is reproduced in our handout. Premise 2, therefore, in order for a belief to wrong, the agent's beliefs must be under their control. Premise 3, agents do not have control over their beliefs. And the conclusion then is beliefs cannot wrong. So the key premise in this is premise 3, that agents do not have control over their beliefs. And the back and forth that I've cut out for time is dealing with exactly what degree we have control over our beliefs. And I think the issue is that a lot of these paradigmatic cases of doxastic wrongings are cases in which even if you do take us to have a significant level of control over our beliefs, the kind of immediate responses that we're trying to get at from a case like Party, or some of the other really famous cases that get talked about in this literature, like the John Hope Franklin case, those cases actually don't leave space for this kind of control. And what I want to do then is think about how this sort of control, this sort of cognitively spontaneous belief fits in with the understanding of doxastic wronging and how it fits in with what people want to identify as the actual wrong of doxastic wronging. So with that in mind, we will shift now to look at what actually the wrongs of doxastic wronging are meant to be, in hopes that will help us kind of identify where we should be looking for a cause of those wrongs. In What We Epistemically Owe Each Other, Basu argues that the harm involved in doxastic wronging is a kind of relational harm. She draws this idea out by considering the following case. This is the racist hermit case on your handout. Suppose a racist hermit in the woods discovers trash containing an alumni newsletter from Sanjeev's university, which includes Sanjeev's photo. The hermit immediately concludes that the pictured person, Sanjeev, smells of curry. Suppose also that Sanjeev happens to have recently made curry. So in this instance, the hermit's belief is true. Sanjeev does smell of curry. Has the hermit wronged Sanjeev? In Basu's analysis, what goes wrong here is that the hermit is failing to relate to Sanjeev in a way that he ought to. I'm inclined to agree with this, but it presents problems for the concept of doxastic wronging as defined above. First, the judgment that the hermit is improperly relating to Sanjeev depends on more than just the belief that Sanjeev smells of curry. It depends on the context and depends on the evidence. Were the hermit, for example, to have read an autobiography of Sanjeev in which he explained that he always smells of curry, unlikely though that may be, the hermit's forming the belief would be a matter of accepting Sanjeev's testimony, and that wouldn't plausibly be an instance of relating improperly to Sanjeev. So if evaluative isolation is true, then the relational harm seems to be an unlikely candidate for the harm because we can't get enough information to determine how the hermit is relating to Sanjeev from the belief alone. We need something like, what is the evidential basis? Second, in this case, it's really difficult to see how this amounts to a harm to Sanjeev. It may be poor moral conditioning for the hermit and may diminish the hermit's capacity to relate to others, but Sanjeev, off at university, seems to be equally well off regardless of the hermit. Perhaps, however, this is an instance of a doxastic wrong that does not involve a doxastic harm. Instead, perhaps Sanjeev has some sort of epistemic right against being the subject of offensive beliefs, or at least poorly based offensive beliefs. Here, however, we return to the first worry: context matters. In order to evaluate whether a particular belief is offensive, we often, and certainly at least sometimes, need to know how the belief came about. To make this yet more stark, we can imagine a case in which scientists have developed a device that, when worn, can cause the wearer to form any belief they choose by stimulating the brain with a very particular pattern of electricity. Suppose now the hermit has been kidnapped by these evil scientists. Even if Sanjeev has some relevant right here, it's very difficult to see how the hermit would be wronging Sanjeev, though perhaps the scientists are. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip over the discussion of Schroeder's views about what goes wrong in instances of doxastic wronging, but I'm totally happy to discuss those. I have a whole view on those too in Q&A if we have time. And those also get more into the John Hope Franklin case, if you're familiar with that. So we can talk about that there. But I take it then that if this kind of thing is what we want to target as the wrong of doxastic wronging, we may need to give up on the idea of evaluative isolation, because the story about how we get from this causal and normative structure to a normative structure that, to an explanation that gets us a difference between the first and second version of the racist hermit case, or the third version with the belief forming helmet, is going to have to involve something else. So now I want to sort of switch focus for a moment toward attention and thinking about whether attention really constitutes an epistemic practice, and then go back to, once we have a kind of view of that on the table, go back to how this idea maybe helps us think through the wronging of doxastic wrongs. At the opening of their paper, Bosser and Schroeder refer to the Book of Common Prayer. In the ritual preceding the Eucharist, the congregation confesses, "We have sinned against you in word, thought, and deed." Thought, word, and deed, actually. Bosser and Schroeder take this as evidence for doxastic wrongings as they define them, complete with evaluative isolation. Yet, this idea, including evaluative isolation, is rather distinct from the notion of a sin of thought, at least as it is taught in the Catholic Church. And the Catechism of the Catholic Church is very clear that sins of all kinds require some degree of consent on the part of the sinner. But as we saw, this is not the case in instances of spontaneous belief, which again are meant to be paradigm cases. of doxastic wronging. And since we can't meaningfully consent to what we cannot control, spontaneous belief remains problematic for evaluative isolation. So what then is at issue? I think that Boston and Schroeder are right that something goes wrong in these cases, and then it should be understood as a matter of epistemic morality. Further, I agree that it has to do with the epistemic motivations that they identify. However, these epistemic motivations, which are actually something that I talked about, I should have picked this up, in the broader version of this paper, the epistemic motivations that they pick out are basically desires to be in a particular belief state. And they take these to go some way toward explaining how it is that we have some level of control. The issue, though, is that they aren't part of epistemic practice. They're simply desires. For example, if you have a epistemic desire to be in a particular belief state, so you want to believe, say, climate change is false or whatever, that's merely a desire to bear the belief relation to a particular proposition. And so it's difficult to offer an analysis on which that sort of desire is any kind of epistemic misstep. Desires aren't part of our epistemic practice, so they're not subject to epistemic evaluation. For example, your desire to believe that your spouse is faithful when they are not is epistemically impeccable so long as it is epistemically inert. It is only when that desire begins to affect your epistemic practice, the way that you inquire, that it becomes the subject of epistemic normativity. So if we want to think about how those sorts of desires are relevant to this question of doxastic wronging, and we think that doxastic wronging is an issue of epistemic morality, so part of our epistemic practice, then we will have to find something downstream from the epistemic desires in order to, that is itself actually part of epistemic practice, in order to pin criticism there. And I think that these motivations, the desires to know or to not know, can affect our epistemic practices by directing our attention. Each of the epistemic effects that Bosser and Schroeder identify for these desires act through ways that they structure an agent's attention. Moreover, to return to the idea of sins of thought, the notion of attending better comports with many explications of such sins in terms of entertaining or as opposed to sort of dismissing or trying to ignore passing thoughts of a morally dubious nature. The epistemology of attention, however, is underexplored, though recent exceptions include work by Susanna Siegel, Jesse Munton, and Georgie Gardner. This oversight is unfortunate because I think that it is here that we may have a clear form of epistemic agency. If this is right, it points to a way to ameliorate our worries about doxastic wronging, though it means giving up on evaluative isolation. For the sake of time, I'm not going to defend a particular account of attention. Instead, I want to sort of briefly sketch the kind of attention I have in mind and then shift focus to the epistemic aspects of the case. So our focus is on conscious attention, the kind of attention that an agent can marshal toward whatever end they please. This is not to say that conscious attention is sort of always under the control of an agent. In fact, it's very often not. But the idea is that you are capable of exerting yourself to control your conscious attention, as you might if you were sort of listening for the cello line of a quartet or the bass line of your favorite rock song. So that's the idea of attention. And the question becomes, is this an epistemic practice? And I think that if we think about the ways that it might affect our epistemic practice, it becomes very clear that it is. So focusing on this idea of conscious personal level attention, we can see that it's an important driver of things like decisions about when to open inquiry, how far to pursue our inquiries, the nature of our evidence gathering processes, and so on. I'm going to skip over, for the sake of time, particular examples of that, though I'm happy to give those in Q&A if we get there, when we get there. But there's a question, even if we sort of focus in on those aspects of how attention is sort of interwoven with our epistemic practices, there's a question about whether that makes the kind of thing that's subject to epistemic morality. In some cases, I take it the answer is no. If you're focusing on your breath with the goal of meditation, it's not likely that is a practice governed by epistemic norms, morally infused or otherwise. However, insofar as your goal is alethic, it seems more plausible. In particular, where the kinds of epistemic motivations that Bossier and Schroeder identify are goals that are shaping your attention, when you are using those goals or desires to shape your conscious experience, this does seem to be an epistemic practice. With that in mind, I think we can divide practices of attending into epistemic and non-epistemic practices in virtue of the goals that ground them. Okay, with that in mind, I want to close by returning to the party case, and we'll think about how this idea of attention helps to suss out what's going wrong here. So our believer sees her partner, as our believer sees her partner, it might take her a while, and she's like walking in the door. It might take her a moment to recall what else she knows about the partner and like the situation. In the regret variant of the case, in the case in which she bats down the belief and sort of feels like, oh, I shouldn't have thought that, she might recall that it's been several years since there was any issue. She might realize that there are other ways that wine smells might end up wafting toward her from her partner, and her confidence in the proposition they fell off the wagon might fall below belief. In this case, it seems strange for the partner to feel wronged. The believer did, I think, what any of us would hope. As soon as she had the opportunity, as soon as she could exercise her agency, she considered her partner fairly and with charity and changed her mind. By contrast, in a version of the case in which her attention remains focused on her suspicions, where she is ruminating on the possibility that her partner fell off the wagon, she's either insensitive to or unmoved by her evidence. She prioritizes affirmation of this proposition about the falling off the wagon over everything else. Her attention is not focused on the conversation she's having with the partner or on appreciating the good evening she's had, etc. This disordered regard for the partner is what makes the resulting conviction that the partner fell off the wagon wrongful. With this in mind, I want to suggest that these cases are better understood as instances of directed, attentive epistemic wrongings, where we'll define that as a wrong committed by one person against another in virtue of the patterns of attention that brought them to their doxastic attitude. By including the belief formation process, this account incorporates a better candidate for the wrongs of doxastic wronging. By way of analogy, if I'm holding a rock and I decide to throw it at someone, I've wronged them by throwing the rock at them, given that I very reasonably believe that they would not want me to hit them with the rock and that I don't have good reason to harm them. The rock's hitting them successfully does not constitute an additional wrong. After it leaves my hand, the final state of affairs, whether it hits or not, is out of my control. Of course, the amends that I'll need to make will differ depending on whether the rock hits them, but my throwing it is what makes me responsible for whatever harms come of that action. In the case of attentional epistemic wrongs, directing my attention is the act, is the throwing of the rock. The final state of affairs, whether I believe that my partner fell off the wagon or not, is out of my control. I can be more or less careful about how I direct my attention, but what happens to my doxastic states when I encounter or fail to encounter new evidence as a result of my choice to direct my attention is beyond my control. Nevertheless, to go back to our rock throwing example, if I miss, I can go pick up the rock and throw it again, thus further wronging my target. Similarly, the agent in the rumination case who attends to the question of whether the spouse was drinking and keeps pursuing it may commit an ongoing series of wrongs entirely independent of whether she actually ends up with the belief. Thus, it seems as though believing the proposition does not cause the wronging, contrary to the idea about the causal structure of doxastic wronging. Rather, the agent coming to believe P and maintaining the belief is one of many possible consequences of the wrong, and it happens to be the hurtful one. Attentive epistemic wronging also makes better sense of the kinds of diagnoses of harm that Bossier suggests. Bossier proposes that we wrong others when we do not engage with them in the participant stance, as in the case of Sanjeev. Yet again, spontaneous belief is not substantially taking any stance toward the person, at least not in any morally significant way that's plausibly necessary for the participant stance. Rather, it is how we manage our attention upon that individual's being brought into our stream of consciousness that determines the stance we take toward them. I think there are a number of other really interesting cases that this sort of account allows us to capture, but I'll leave those for time. And the broader point that I'll close on is this. I think that our relationships with others can engender obligations toward them, and some of those obligations concern our attention. Plausibly, for example, our children have strong claim to our attention. My argument here is that these obligations are relatively easy to create through forming relationships with others, and they are morally significant. The contours of those obligations are determined by the particular relationship. Furthermore, since attention, as construed above, is both epistemic and subject to agential control, failure to uphold these attentional obligations may be reasonably construed as a wronging, and in particular, an epistemic wronging. If this analysis is correct, we do lose evaluative isolation, but in its stead, we gain a clear explanation for how and why these epistemic practices are morally significant. And I will close there. Thank you.
Sorry, I meant to